Thanks for joining us for Conversations That Matter this evening. This month's episode, we are very excited to have some very wonderful people, two pastors from our Jonesborough community from two different churches. We've got Pastor Vincent Dial and Pastor Alan Huff with us, and I'm going to turn this around and let them each give us just a little bit of information about them, where you're from, how do you keep it brief now. I know you are both used to having your own pulpit, but this is a short program. I'm going to turn this around, and we'll start with you, Pastor Dial, if you wouldn't mind to just let us know a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Katelyn. My name is Vincent Dial. I'm a native of Columbia, South Carolina. I graduated from elementary and high school in Columbia. Came to Carson-Newman College, now Carson-Newman University, on athletic and eventually a music scholarship. I graduated from Carson-Newman with my degree in music education. So many things happened in between. Played some pro ball with Kansas City Chiefs as a free agent, but due to an injury, I had to move away from there and go into what God really put me into. And that was to teach students and preach the gospel. I'm married. I'm a beautiful wife married. We have 3 kids, 3 grown kids. We have 4 grandchildren. And I'm pastor of Bethel Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, which I'm going on my 22nd year now of being there. So I put that in a nutshell in a pastor's abbreviated message. So
we appreciate you for that. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Alan Huff from the pastor Jonesborough Presbyterian Church, it's a PCUSA congregation, and in Holston Presbyterian. I grew up about 70 miles west of Vincent. Grew up in Augusta, Georgia, and I'm from family from Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, so very much a product of the South. And went to seminary right out of college. Went to Presbyterian College in Clinton, South Carolina. Went to seminary in the right place, wrong time. Taught school for 6 years, then went back. So I've been in the ministry for about 24 years, and have been in Jonesborough for 10 years. My wife, Mary Ann, and I live in Jonesborough. She works at the International Storytelling Center for the festival. She's the registrar there, and we have 2 kids. And they're in the area too, and we just have our first grandchild, who is not even 2 weeks old yet. So we're brand new grandparents.
Congratulations. Yes, that's great. Well, thank you for that little bit of information. And so we are co-moderating this evening, which means I'm the comedic relief and working the computer. And Michelle is going to be dishing out the questions tonight and keeping things moving for us. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
Okay, so my first question for both of you is, when did you know that you were destined for ministry? And we can, Mr. Dahl, if you want to go first.
well, my mother told me about in the backyard. I was standing on some type of a farm, and I was preaching to them. Then on a little serious note, I got to deal with and I was so ill that because I was not making it through the night. So one of the sacraments that lasted like 16 months, and they ministered to me. But as Reverend Joseph Beaver, who was one of the priests, and there was Reverend Terrence Brown, who came to administer the sacrament, and he Reverend Beaver leaned over to my bed and said, "Look, I'm not through with you yet. We have something for you to do. Even to be at a place in October 26th, 2020 here in Jonesborough, I'm supposed to be here." So, and from that point on, and I've had other people ask me whether I minister at my grandmother, and they kind of anointed me and laid hands on me and said, "You will be a minister someday." But it really struck me when I was playing the role of Pearl Victoria in the play Pearl. And I had to preach this monologue of how I went up and beat up old Captain Coffee up on the hill because he had assaulted my little girl, and that actually came into a preaching moment. But after that, I began to think what people said to me, and I began to think what my mother said. So it it was a natural progression of events, but I was basically not accepting that call, and eventually I did. That's kind of in a nutshell.
Wow. That's pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing. Now, are we having some microphone issues? Everybody able to hear?
Yeah, the sound is spotty, so just everyone just be loud.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. All right, and then Mr. Huff, how about you?
Well, I appreciate Vincent's story because a seminary professor of mine said one time that God and mothers called children to the ministry together. And but I had considered it when I was in high school and in college, because church was a place that had created for me a space to be and become. I was a very shy, withdrawn child, particularly in high school, and church was a place of belonging and acceptance. And so I went. One of the places where I really began to discover myself and my gift was working at a summer camp, and a lot of ministers have that same experience of working at summer camps, and that's where I really began to find a person in here that I appreciated and was had some gifts and some talents and was kind of fun at times. And so, but the years spent teaching in between the seminary study were extremely important years, because I got to do a lot of growing up that I needed to do, and realizing that I was an okay teacher, a mediocre teacher, and that I could probably be a pretty good pastor was one of the reasons that I left teaching after those 6 years and went to ministry, and have been very grateful for that move.
So we're going to jump right in here with the conversations that matter and some issues with race. How do you both see two different churches, a black church and a white church, if I may? How do you see that in Washington County? Or is there such a thing as two different churches?
Meaning segregation.
Segregation, the way the church, the music, how would you see that, if you do, as two different churches?
We talked about this yesterday, and it really, in the carnal sense of the word, in the ethnic sense of the word, there's a predominantly black congregation at Bethel Christian, but there are other people from other ethnic groups who attend.
Okay.
We really, it just so happened that historically, and when you study the history of Bethel Christian Church, actually grew out of Boone's Creek Christian Church. And the reason why the African American participants left Boone's Creek, there were some issues with the Ku Klux Klan and some threats. And so back in the late to middle 1800s, they left and they came here. And Dr. Hezekiah Hinkle, who's a well-known physician and preacher, basically he planted Bethel Christian, West Main Street Christian Church, and he planted one other congregation in Bristol, Tennessee. When it's all said and done, at the end of the day, it's not really black or white, it's really the church of God in Christ. And I say that from a biblical perspective, not as a denomination. And I think that's one of the things that Alan and I discussed. Yes, it's about the fact that we're human beings, and it's human nature to identify and to label the different parts of society, the black church, the white church, now the Mexican church, the Chinese church, but we all God's children. And if you want to call it a congregation, because the church, we are not the church, the individual. We have black congregation, predominantly black, predominantly white, but we're all basically seeking the very same thing, is to have that personal relationship with Jesus Christ.
I think that a lot of the cultural differences, transcend the black, white, just the skin color. The cultural differences from rural churches to urban churches and suburban churches and conservative and more progressive churches, those things really create more of the difference than I think than the black and the white, I think. And there are different worship styles in all of those. And people kind of look for a place in which, unfortunately, they just feel comfortable rather than feel challenged and enriched. And I think that getting together, and not just for worship together or swapping pastors, but I think doing real ministry, real mission together is an incredible way to bring disparate opinions together and find a common ground of being grounded in Christ, rooted in love, and appreciate the differences, not try to do away with them, but to appreciate them.
What are some of the things that your church would do, and this is either separately or together, to kind of create a bridge between these two different churches or different cultures that are within that church? And before, what are some things that your church will do to kind of create a bridge between, whether it's together or individually with other churches? How would you create a bridge between these two?
We can jam on in a video and those 9 people. About, if not that very next Sunday, it was 2 weeks after that, we had an opportunity for dialogue to talk about racism in the church and the racism and the hatred that basically caused this young man to go into a church sanctuary or go into a building and take the lives of these 9 people. So I think that was something that was very, I think had an impact on me, is that if we don't do a better job of expressing the love of Christ for each other, then we're just as guilty as the person who stands outside a door and then decides to go back in and take the lives of innocent people.
Right.
And I think we have to listen to each other, particularly the Euro-Americans need to listen to the African-American stories. And one of the things that Vincent and I have done is sit down over cups of coffee and we've just listened and talked. And he has challenged me to be really honest. And I think I've done that. And so individually, that's extremely important to listen to the stories, to listen to the realities that get glossed over. This vigil against racism that's been going on once a month in Jonesborough is a great place to do that, just to go and recite the names of those who have died by racial violence, for decades. The list is a decades-long list, and doesn't take that long to recite them, but it goes back to the 50s, to Emmett Till. And I think that's an important thing to do, to name that, put faces, listen to those stories, understand. One of the books that I just read by a guy named Robert P. Jones, I think, it's called, I said that book to you the other day. Quite Too Long.
Quite Too Long, yes.
It's from a James Baldwin quote. Quite Too Long, the legacy of white supremacy and in American Christianity. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And I just read that a few weeks ago. And those are extremely uncomfortable things for, folks on my side of the street, in my congregation to read. And many of them, will not. And I understand it's extremely difficult to do, but I also found it humbling and a call to action. What I'm going to do with that, I don't know yet, but that's why, Vincent and I want to keep up our conversation and get deeper into that. But it does call for some vulnerability, between the races, between the individuals, and it calls for honesty and a willingness to not so much, it's not about guilt. It's about understanding the realities that, for me, it's about understanding that I am in a culture, was raised in a culture that benefited and benefits from systemic racism. And, you know, that has to be kind of in the forefront of my mind all the time, or some, you know, around all the decisions that I make. And so.
Right. If you could repeat the name of that book again, because I think some people may want to read that. I think
It's
I
called
would.
White Too Long.
And then can you share maybe one or two points that really grabbed you as you read that book?
The complicity of the white church in not just intimidating, but in perpetrating violence against Black people in the South in particular, not just in the South, but the complicity, not just turning a blind eye, but the actual participation in that. On a Sunday morning, I don't remember the man's name, who was lynched in Macon, Georgia, or down just south of Atlanta, and then, you know, the elders were back in the church that morning celebrating God's love. And the other thing actually that happened in Macon, Georgia as well, there are two churches that had, an African American church and a white church, had gotten together and started working together. They had gone to the museum in Washington, and the conversation, particularly amongst the African American members of the churches, were going to Washington. They were afraid, some of the parents were afraid of their kids going up there in the presence of white folks that were, that could be dangerous for them. And those lingering feelings of vulnerability. But the way that those two congregations have begun not just to, get together to worship, but actually to share mission and share conversations. I was very moved by what's going on in that church right there in the heart of Georgia, in Middle Georgia. And so those were a couple of things.
There's a quick question here. Are there any facilitated book and discussion groups that anyone could join? Is that something that maybe you guys see in your future, leading your congregations, of having some book clubs that are pressing?
Right. Remember, Alan and I have talked about this about 2 or 3 years ago. What could we do? And Bob Roberson was another one. He passed, he's retired now. But we talked about the reading literature in those books. One of my favorite authors is Howard Thurman, Dr. Howard Thurman. And this present darkness, this luminous darkness he writes about, about racism in the church. And this is back, I think, in the middle 40s. So he was ahead of his time. But Alan and I, again, and we have reestablished those conversations. And that's one of the things that I actually spoke to my wife about having a book reading ministry to read about and to have open and honest conversations, because it's like, I was talking to Alan, and I say, Alan, have you ever used the word nigger? And Alan's response was,
I'm a Southern white boy with all the baggage.
See,
forgive me.
And so I said, yeah, because I use the word cracker all the time, and look, here's what makes conversations useless: when people do not put it on the table. Sometimes what has to be put on the table can be a little bit disturbing, but it's real, it happens, and to some sad degree, it's still happening today. So to get back to the original question, yeah, there will be, and if anybody's interested, they can contact us. We can see what, we can participate, but, and I'm quite sure there are people here in Tri-Cities, there are those reading book clubs that are already established. I just don't know of any right now.
There are several.
We're a group from our congregation is about to start reading a book called The Hidden Wound by Wendell Berry. It's a very short book, but he actually wrote it just over the Christmas vacation when he was in residence at maybe in Berkeley, 68, 69. And I don't think he actually published it until the 80s, late 80s, 20 years later. And I didn't just read it until recently. But we're going to read that one. It's a short book, and the first 3 chapters kind of express Berry's reflections on how humanity in general typically needs some group to scapegoat, to put them in a place of subservience and give them the jobs that are looked down upon. And then that, the reality of slavery in the American South, was created that dynamic in our culture. And then just because the Emancipation Proclamation, that didn't end the struggle by any stretch of the imagination. So he talks about that from the economic perspective of needing these people to look down upon to do the menial jobs. And then he reflects on African-American man and a woman who were on his grandfather's farm in Kentucky. And so it's a beautiful, easy way to kind of invite people into, it's an easy way to invite white people into the conversation to reflect. And beyond that, my wife was in a book club that just read White Fragility. I've not read that one yet. So you want to talk about race? I think that's a really difficult one to read. I've started that one, I hadn't finished it. So, I think it would be great to do something together. I think the dynamic in there of not expecting the African American members of a book group to explain everything, right? Is going to they have to get race and ground rules for that. Neutral, and white folks can't be looking for absolution the whole time either. But the willingness to be honest and lay things on the table. And I think the black-white dialogue, I haven't been to one of those yet, but I think that's been from what I understand, that's been a really good start, even though that's conversation and not a book study as such.
Right.
And speaking of the black-white dialogue, I know Mr. Wolf is watching right now. He did have a question earlier about how can you work with your congregation to dismantle racism? So I know that, education, further education and things of that matter, calls to action, I'm guessing, of, the black-white dialogue, which I actually get to present next month. I'm a little nervous about it, but I'm going to do it. And I'm happy to be there for that. But that is a very good first step for those that are not ready to put it all out there on the table, as you said, Pastor Dial.
Well, it's, and I guess, it's according to what experiences one comes from background-wise. We're talking racism in the Bible, okay? And the various vignettes, the different biblical characters and things that happen. We talked about the very obvious racism between Jews and Gentiles. The Jews held themselves to be much more holier and a greater, higher esteem than Gentiles. They were pretty much the lowest of the low. Anybody who wasn't a Jew was considered to be a Gentile. So that's why I think some of the things we need to we put out on the table and say, because some of these very same things, as the scripture says, slaves, you should obey your masters. And it says, masters, you should be basically nice to your slaves. But those scriptures, when we see that, and there's some congregation who absolutely will not read those, African-American congregation. However, in the instituting of the institution of slavery, and that's another thing I had to correct people who said, well, when we went to Africa and got the slaves, no, you went to Africa and you kidnapped thousands of people, and then you brought them back here, you sold them into slavery. That's a different thing. And so when I look at that, we have to look at that. It's hard sometimes, but it's true. And there's more to the black-white experience than let's talk about slavery. That's with the history books. That's the only thing you would see about slavery. You may read about the Emancipation Proclamation. But we need to read about people like Fannie Lou Hamer. We need to read about people like that, you know, who say, what was it? I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. So now we're into a whole new groove of protesting, of speaking, of conversations, of dialogue, because now I think the generation now is more openly and more overt about their feelings and their emotions, where my generation, when in my 20s, I marched and we protested, and then eventually as we got older, we began to negotiate. And that negotiation took place behind doors sometimes. And it wasn't on national news, it's that it was a way that things could be accomplished. And I'm very happy to say, or proud to say, that things were accomplished. And we were not out in the streets protesting. And don't get me wrong, I think the time is now for what these young people are doing, to bring things, say, look, we're tired of it. We don't want to grow up and repeat what the generations before us did. We don't want to repeat that. It can't be repeated. If we do, we'll surely annihilate each other.
That's a perfect lead into the next question, and it's about this summer with the death of George Floyd. So my question to you both is, what are your overall thoughts about the summer, and what role does your church or religion play in moving forward from this point, from the death of George Floyd and the protests and all surrounding that?
The video of his death was, an indisputable thing. It wasn't hearsay. There it was, and so that put it right in people's faces. And so the emotional response to that has been culturally has just been this upheaval. And as a Christian and as a pastor, who does not believe that violence solves anything but just continues more violence, I've been very hurt by all of that. But this is in the big picture, this is an incredible cry. This is I don't condone the violence, but I hear the cry for justice. And in my preaching, I try to. I can't help it at this point. See the connections between whatever text I'm preaching on, and how God's call to us to live differently is extraordinarily relevant right now. And I think that the church is, if the church is going to continue to be relevant, and it's already having terrible, terrible struggles doing that right now. If it's going to be relevant, it must speak to these kinds of issues and call people to respond in love, but also in firmness and with real conviction that says, we are all, as I can't remember what mystic it was from the 1600s. We're not just made by God; we're made of God. This affirmation of the whole creation as something infused with the Spirit, with the holiness of God. So to see God's Spirit in one another, to see God's presence in one another is a place to start asking people to reflect very seriously on the scriptural texts, and on the cultural situation, and how do we then live this faith in the midst of a great deal of turmoil, so that it brings hope and peace, and not more division and more just loudness.
How about you?
Well, I guess when I saw that, it brought back memories to some degree. My father and my mother's lives were threatened at gunpoint, and what I got from seeing that police officer with his knee on his neck and he's saying, "I can't breathe," and then when he called for his mother, that just drained me, because I know that whenever I would get in some predicament or I was hurt or fell down, the first person I would call would be my mother. And it's almost, it was a very strange sequence of events here in this all public view of the whole world. He basically murdered this guy on international TV. I mean, it's right there. And you have to ask yourself this question. You can't excuse yourself out of this one. It's there to be seen, you know, and I actually have a law enforcement, a friend of mine, he says, you know, sometimes you just don't see everything on the video. I say, that may be true, but in this case, for 8 minutes, this man kept his knee on this man's neck. And I think that's one of the things about racism in America. Racism is the knee on America's neck. And we're struggling with this. We keep struggling with it. Essentially, we have to begin to accept where I was, and then you have to also become transparent enough to say, I don't want to be there anymore. So the knee that's on America's neck, that racism, the knee of racism, and once that knee can start being lifted, then we'll start seeing some changes. And then there's two things that it drives me. It's the great commandment. Love the Lord thy God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. God wants us to be thinkers, to use our mind, to use our both physical and spiritual strength to help change things. Secondly, he says, second to that, love your neighbor as yourself. He says all the other commandments, all the other things that need to be done and should be done hang on these two commandments. So that's like, I honestly feel, and it came to me when the knee of racism is taken off the neck of America, then we'll see real change. We'll see real love begin to grow and to be nurtured in this country, in this world.
Amen.
Wow. So when was the first time you actually either one personally experienced racism or you witnessed racism? Can you think back to the first time or a significant time that it really touched you?
No.
Well, I mean, we need to hear from you on this one more than me, but you know, the first, this isn't racism so much, but when I was in the first grade in Durham, North Carolina, I remember my dad sitting me down before sending me back to school after the Christmas break. And I was just, you know, first grader, I was just looking at my brand new backpack in the mirror there on his dresser. And you know, I wasn't really paying that much attention to what he said, but he was saying something about when you get back to school, there are going to be some people missing that were there before Christmas, and there are going to be some people there that are new. And you just treat them like you treat anybody else. And so when I got there, of course, the integration had happened over the Christmas break. And so that was really my first introduction to being, you know, in your classrooms and in community with African-American kids. That, you know, of course, they came from wherever they, you know, their school and their community. And so there wasn't a whole lot of interaction there. And then we moved to Augusta very shortly after that. But it was, you know, the racism that I've experienced, you know, like I said, from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, you know, I've got the experience of being around people who are very, very blatant, very just very racist in their speech, in their actions, and start their sentences with, "I'm not a racist, but." So when I was on the fire department I was part-time fireman when I was teaching school, and some of the things that I heard there were, I'm not going to repeat them, you know, that kind of thing. And when I had to apologize to Vincent, when I told him about that, was, Vincent, I apologize because I didn't say anything.
Yeah. How about you?
Greyhound bus station maybe 58, 59 in Columbia, South Carolina. And my brother invited me to join him in drinking out of the white water fountain. It says whites only. And so remember, I'm thinking we'll turn white,
That's what I said.
No, we won't turn white. So anyway, as we begin to drink out of the white water fountain, the local security, he came, what you in doing drinking out of that, that's not for you. I'm calling the police, you going to jail, boy. You boys going to jail. I remember my grandmother, her name was Wilhelmina Dial. Boy, she was she was before her time. She just said, please don't send my boys to jail. And what I remember, after she had negotiated our release, we were held like hostage, I guess, for about 30 minutes. And he was just ranting and raving about how I'm telling people we drank out of the white water fountain. But what was so significant about that was my grandmother had us look over the two fountains. And I remember these placards. They were white placards with black bordering. And she says, right there, that's the water fountain you drink out of. It says colored. Over here, this is for the white folk only. So I basically chalked that up as my first reading lesson, because I knew how to read colored and white so that, we wouldn't get in trouble. Many people lost their lives drinking out of the white water fountain. I remember going to the movies, having to sit upstairs in the balcony. But that's a whole nother story. That's a whole nother set of dynamics. But what's so poignant about that is that's really one of the first things, or the first words I remember, and it's still etched in my mind, was colored and white on those big white placards with black bordering. And my grandmother, Miss Wilhelmina Dial, who had a 4th grade education, a brilliant woman, one of my heroes, and she taught me, and she stood for us too. And I knew she said, I'd go to jail before I would let my grandsons go to jail. So, but that sticks with me and always will be a part of me.
So do you guys have, I know we said if you wanted to come up with some questions for each other, do you have anyone have a question that you would like to ask the other? I
guess as Alan, I would just like to ask, how have our conversations been to you? How have they been of any help to you, or is this something that we do? We get together, we talk about, and then we don't think about it when we part from each other's company.
Oh yeah, I find them extremely rich and rewarding and stimulating. And so I mean, I don't know that I have any questions for Vincent, because we've been hanging out for 10 years together. And is there anything more that I can do? Any other way for me to be engaged in what needs to happen?
Well, no, Alan, you know why? Because what Alan and I do, it's a natural progression. It's not like force busing. You gotta go. We gotta go, and then we're gonna sing Kumbaya at the end and go our separate ways. But no, it's this. And I didn't know Alan was gonna be on this broadcast tonight until I saw his name. And so when we got together yesterday morning, and it feels natural. It's not like it's something that's contrived, something that's being formulated, and you got to do this, you got to have these questions, you got to answer them this way, and that's not. Sometimes, like when we're talking, we have to be very up and honest with each other. I think that's one of the things about the movement today. Sometimes people will smile when they're crying, and we've got to stop this pretentious attitude and be willing. If people really want to see America change, they want to see a change in the world. I want to see a change for my grandchildren and their children, but we can't do that just by pretending. We must be about the real business of loving one another the way the Lord tells us to love each other. That agape love is unconditional and it's forgiving. I think one of the things about America today is that there's too many people in America who still filled with hate and will not forgive, will not accept the truth of what real love is about.
How do your conversations come to be? You guys, because when we were picking people, we're like, I know Vincent and I know Alan. So do you guys just say, hey, let's meet for coffee, or how does this conversation come for the two of you?
That's pretty much it.
Is it?
That's pretty much. Alan is an avid reader. He reads a lot more than I do. And
I've got him thinking that anyway.
Yeah, because he'll say, have you read this? I said, no, have you read this? You know, or he's given me a book or two, you know, and it's been very inspiring, you know. If it's something I say, Alan, you know, check this article out, you know, but it's a natural progression. It's not like, hey, Alan, I want to meet on the 4th Monday of every month, okay?
Right.
It's not like that. We try to come together when we can, when our schedules will allow us to.
Or when the moment demands it, like after the Charleston murders.
Yeah.
And you know, we get together. Like JAMA is a big deal, so we have been meeting. Well, it hadn't been every month recently, but because of COVID. But you know, we get together and we do the work of JAMA, of being sure this food pantry is up and running. I was out here all morning today,
right.
and you know, at the Christmas
gathering.
And so he and I and Karen Lane, who's the board chair of JAMA,
and we pastor.
At Jonesborough United Methodist. We sang a song together up there for Christmas. And so we'd get together and practice this song, and he'd play the djembe and I would play the guitar, and we, you know, so there's that aspect.
Sure.
Just you know, doing the things that matter to our community, as well as talking about there's friendship. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And if our children matter to us, let's talk and teach them about things that matter.
Right.
You know, if they really matter to us, because if not, this generation will repeat the same trials and tribulations, and we'll still be marching in the streets protesting. Right. But I pray that and as time goes on, there won't be a need for protests like we're doing now. But it's getting attention, it's getting the world's attention. And somebody says, wake up world, because you're asleep at the wheel.
That's great. I think these conversations that you two have are really, really important. I think that's the foundation of actual change. So we're looking at about 10 more minutes. So we've got some questions here. We do. Let's see. First one up is, how racist is Jonesborough? Question mark.
Well, for the asker of that question, it's all according to who you're talking to, and their experience that they've had here in Jonesborough, whether they're native of Jonesborough or they have become a transplant, they've moved into Jonesborough, or you know, they visited Jonesborough during vacation. And I think, and then when you say how racist is it, you know, it could be as racist as somebody wants it to be. You know, it just all depends. I think it depends on the individual experience and how they were treated, how they were received, or how they grew up here in Jonesborough. Because as Alan and I were talking yesterday, there's some stories about how when segregation or desegregation had happened, and the schools were still to some degree segregated. But the kids played together all the time. They played together all the time. Come time for school to start, they went their separate ways, you know. But they were able to work through that. I think Jonesborough, myself, has been somewhat very progressive when it comes to racial issues. However, I still think there's some polarization here. It has been, and it continues to be here. So I think it's depending on the individual or a particular group of people that you can ask that question to, because I'm quite sure you'll get different answers.
Yeah, exactly. Jonesborough, Northeast Tennessee, is the least racially diverse place I've ever lived. So I think that there's a lot of the tension that just doesn't exist because it's the whitest place I've ever lived, you know. So there's not the dynamic that there is in Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi, other places that I've experienced. But I think Vincent's right on. It depends on who you talk to. A lot of folks that I'm in conversation with, you know, they're more concerned about racism and what can we do about it rather than being
Apprehensive.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I told y'all I'm on the balcony with my binoculars. I'm on Main Street. I see all the things. It is whoever, in the eye of it's different vantage points. That's very true.
so let's see, we've got some comments, powerful words. Thankful for your words. Another question is, which communities or entities or even individual persons inspire you relative to change? So that makes it relative to change that is taking place now. So who is inspiring you when it comes to seeing change in this community? It could be entities or individuals. What inspires you?
Well, it's not really a person from this community. Really, my inspiration really comes from my mother. And she passed on about a year ago. But I always remember we had an incident that happened very quickly. Fast forward, we were under attack by a small white mob of very hateful people. But I remember my mother looking at me. She said, "Vincent, don't you ever learn to hate like that, because if you do, it'll be so hard to exercise it out of your system, to get it out of your system." And I remember that. And I remember my mother worked at Fort Jackson, and we went to summer camp. It's an interesting thing because of the segregation of military installations, federal buildings. I think under the Truman, I think it was under his administration, we went to day camp every day. And we went to the pool, I think Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And we swam with white kids, Hispanic kids, Puerto Rican, Filipino, you name it. But the interesting thing is, the minute you crossed out of the gate, if you were riding public transportation, African Americans had to get off and get onto the back of the bus. So, it was, but my mother and then my father too, because oftentimes fathers don't get mentioned. I saw him stand up to people, and he stood and would not move because he stood on principle. And that was another thing, man, because to stand up to a white man in the 50s and tell him what he wasn't going to do and what he could not do. And I know that the hand of God was on my daddy, So I would have to say my parents and my grandparents, because I saw them endure and go through a lot, but they still held strong. They still kept pushing, providing for us, encouraging us. So yeah, those are some of my heroes. And of course, they're, then my community, the people where I grew up on Standish Street and Standish Acres. Anybody out there, I'm gonna give them a shout out in Columbia. I mean, it was a community like no other. So, but I never heard my parents say, "You can't go there because these white kids are here. You can't do this or you can't do that because of the color of your skin." We were always encouraged, do your best.
Yeah. How about you?
The late great John Lewis. You talked about standing up on the box,
yeah,
preaching.
Yeah,
he did the same thing, preaching to the chickens.
Yeah,
and he did that in the exact same county in Alabama where my mom's parents are from. And so to have read that story and heard that story about him, and what and he met all of the violence against him with love. And I could not have done what he did. I could not have done it. And but to know that there are stories and examples like John Lewis out there, and even the people in the group that Dylan Roof, they were there. Yeah. They welcomed him, and then they opened their arms to him, and he came within a hair's breadth of not doing what he went there to do because he had been received with that kind of compassion. And so learning those stories is a great way to begin to grow into the change.
Okay, so this one is, how does social justice play a role in Christianity, and how does the church need to be better, or why should they be better about social justice?
I think, well, as far as social justice, is like Micah, the prophet, chapter 6, verse 8. He said, what would God have you do? He says, show justice to people, show mercy, be loving, and then walk humbly with God. I think that's one of the things the church has to realize, that it's not some house on the hill and everybody's bowing down to it. And I guess that's what disturbs me, because that's where we have to come true with ourselves. You know, we have not really been following the word of God. We've been following man's word and do what man has said we should do and how we should do it. So when you talk about social justice, Jesus was probably one of the biggest promoters, not probably, but was the biggest and still is largest promoter of social justice, to the point where he gave his life so that others could live, you know. So it's you just have to you look at yourself and say, you see yourself for who you really are, and say, man, I got some work to do. I'm so busy pointing fingers, you know. I'm not looking at Vincent in the mirror, you know. So, and the church is going to have to look at itself, each individual congregant, and then the congregation as a whole. And I think we'll see some changes among God's people, because we got some work that we need to have done on us as well. We're not perfect and pure and free of sin. Praise the Lord.
Yeah, social justice, I think, is one of those terms that creates a lot of anxiety in people because they associate it with a lot of political stuff. But, you know, one of the things, I guess what I didn't say when I said who has influenced me recently, that, you know, again, that's been Jesus. That's been preaching gospel passages, and the way his life calls us to a different way of living. And that's from a theological standpoint. And so, you know, society, you know, we're always in society, we're in community. And so, you know, to do justly in community is to do social justice, and that can be done from the standpoint of the Christian faith. And I think the church's stand has got to be to live and encourage and nurture this understanding of the creation as all of creation being beloved by God, and then to work toward wholeness for all people. I know one author that I like a lot says she doesn't like the word hope. It's just, you know, it's flimsy. And but what I think she's saying is that when she hears the word hope, she's just hearing the word wish, you know. But Christian, one of my favorite authors is a guy named Richard Rohr, a Franciscan friar, and he said in one of his books he defines hope as the ability to hold creative tensions, and you know, that's a theological definition of hope, the tension. So we don't think in this dualistic right, wrong, black, white, us, them, this competitive zero-sum game way of being in relationship. So, you know, to hold ourselves, even the things inside us that are tearing us apart, hold those in tension. Hold, you know, I hope that our conversations have that tension in them, and so that out of that something new can come. And I think that the justice side of that is you know, doing justice, loving kindness, walking humbly with God, loving neighbor, you know, and valuing the entire creation as something that is imbued with the presence and love and promise of God.
And Jesus said, you know, what you do to the least of these, my brothers, you do unto me.
Right.
And some people don't understand that text within that context, is that as long as you live in the same zip code that I do, and you have the same educational pedigree that I have, in the same neighborhood, then we're okay. But it's the least of these. And this is where I think a lot of the anxiety and a lot of the suffering takes place in our society, because the people who need it most, sometimes we show them the very least of our concern. So I think that's another thing. As we talk about racism and classism and all these other isms, we need to think, am I doing what I should be doing to reach out to my brother who has far less than I do, who smells a little bit different than I do, who looks a little bit different than I do? That's where I think the body of Christ, the church, the ecclesia of Christ, has got to start and reaching out and making those efforts. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to smell good all the time. but is doing what Christ did. And that's what we're supposed to do.
That's holding that tension.
Yes,
Mhm.
yeah.
I think that a lot of people are at a place where they don't see, I can speak for myself with this, I don't see a lot of that attention given to the least of these. And it tends to kind of cast a little shadow on Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a question kind of leading into this is, given the current social justice atmosphere and the upcoming election, how do I hold my anger when I see people from my church family posting such hate on social media? And that's that idea that, okay, you're telling me you're a Christian, but you're surely not acting like it. And what I'm reading, which kind of casts a little shadow.
You've got to ask the person asking the question is, see, that's where the agape love comes in, because it rises above understanding. It's a peace that rises above all understanding. That when you see that person and they are a part of the congregation which you worship in, that's where you have to find that space to continue loving that person. Again, Jesus is the ultimate example. They hated him and nailed him to a cross, but he still asked his Father to forgive them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think rather than, that's one of the things about churchism. See, we want to be mad at somebody, we want to be pointing the fingers, and, you know, of course, we're so pure and perfect and without sin.
Get the
But-
pitchfork. Put it on the cross.
KK, we miss that. And that's where Alan and I think our discussions have become more and more real, more and more open to do. Because if the church looks like the world, then we got a lot of work to do. And if people are seeing what Michelle is seeing and saying, wait a minute, shouldn't they be feeding rather than pointing fingers at them and calling them names and kicking them out or whatever the case may be. Now, from the other perspective, it's a struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Because I look at our homeless population in Johnson City, and those numbers are growing. So for that person, remember the love of Christ. Let that take over. Because in the flesh, we just can't do it. Mm-hmm. We're going to be angry. We're going to be fussy. We're going to be confrontational. So.
One thing that I tried to do, one thing I did when I was faced with all of that same kind of hateful speech on Facebook is I deleted my account. I'm done, but I'm not on Facebook anymore. So maybe that's denial, but my quality of life has gone up because I'm not just immersed in that culture just sort of being able to spout off without having much of any accountability. It's just I don't find that helpful. But in relation to the person who asked the question, though, I would say remember that hate is coming from somebody who is all at war within themselves somehow. They are they are projecting their self-loathing onto someone else, and so when I hear that kind of thing and I begin to feel that sense of returning the anger for the anger, then I have to stop and say, okay, what am I projecting then onto that person? Because I can only take care of myself. I can't affect what they think and what they do. I can only respond in a way that I think is faithful to what I think Jesus has asked us and called us and given us an example to do. And so what am I projecting onto that person? What part of myself, am I reacting to and trying to repress that's going to come out and bite somebody or bite me in some other way? That sounds like pop psychology, but I think it's very much, that internal struggle that we all have. And, because it's going to come out as judgment rather than, okay, well, what am I thinking? What am I doing? Why is that making me so angry? And what am I projecting onto that person? I'm putting all of my self-loathing onto them at this point. So why? What's in me that's actually feels that way and I'm judging.
I wonder if people feel that by asking themselves, why am I projecting? Why am I feeling this? Versus, I'm tired of sitting back and being passive. I want to change this.
Right.
How does that person, do they approach that person and say, what's going on? Do you just hold that anger? Do you try to diffuse it and say, it's okay, let it go? I mean, what do you do with that? Because I think there is a fine line between, okay, this is enough. It's 2020 and this stuff needs to stop. And I want to be part of that change versus we're doing it again and I'll pray for them and we'll move on. Where's that?
It's a system of choices too, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You can choose to be angry for the rest of your life and choose to be angry at this particular group or that group. But if you're claiming to be one who's in Christ and following the teachings and the discipleship of Jesus Christ, then it's not you, it's the spirit of that Christ that will move and will work within you. Because some people want to be angry. Some people want to be upset, and nothing you can say. Mm-hmm. So I feel like from a biblical perspective, it's not until something happens in that person's spiritual heart that changes them to say, okay, I don't want to be a part of what I was 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. I don't want my children to be a part of that. We have to make conscious requests within ourselves that, Lord, change me, because I can't do it. You know, I can't do it. It's what it took for me. I was considered as a black militant when I was in high school. And in my college days, you know, I had the big fro, had the power to the people's dashiki. I had it all. You know, I mean, I had a fro out here, you wouldn't believe it, but it was there. And then one day, a gentleman said something to me. He was a teacher, but he worked in the barbershop on the weekend. He says, one day, if you allow yourself to be open, your heart will be changed. You're not going to be as angry. You're not going to be so mad. You're not going to be raising a clenched fist. He says nothing wrong with that, and be proud of who God made you to be, but be willing to change for the better so that things can be better for the generations coming behind you.
I think positive action is redeemed anger. I think that's, you know, that the whole metaphor of resurrection, the image of resurrection that puts us into a new life, calls us into a new way of being, seeing ourselves and seeing others and seeing the true self, and that is this new thing that we can be in Christ. And I think going to that person who makes us angry and saying, you know, that we need to talk about this, and because I don't understand. Help me to understand where this is coming from. And you know, you can only say that so often, you know, perhaps, you know, you get enough of that. I have a friend who's, you know, kind of gets tired of saying, well, help me to understand, because, but, you know, but to turn that anger into positive action, to show up, and I don't mean for anything in particular, but just to show up. I think the new word is be woke, you know, to show up and be present to those who are angry and hurt. I mean, what is it that's causing that? Help me to understand, and also to be present with those against whom that anger is directed, saying, "Hey, I don't get what's going on, but I love you."
Right. And that's that beginning of that conversation. I think you're right with that. So I encourage whoever that question is from to you know, step up and be a change, and maybe ask them, help me understand where these comments and your actions are coming from. There are so many incredible questions here. I don't know if we can save them. Okay, perfect.
I took a photo.
We can do a photo, and then we might get them out back to you guys, and then maybe answer them on Facebook. So lots of really cool questions, a lot of call to action, maybe some work for y'all. I mean, it's really good stuff. Very good stuff. So,
what was one of the call to action was as far as the body of Christ is concerned, the church?
One was, I think it was, how can we move on actions or discussions on a community level to identify how racism shows up and find a collective way to confront specific situations.
Mm-hmm.
Could there be an ad hoc citizen committee to move the needle on local racism as part of the town structure? So lots of good
as a
ideas.
monitoring type committee to monitor and see, be on the pulse of the city, wherever it may be. I think with the COVID-19, I think that's one of the things that's so distracting and so much of that's hamstringing us, from coming together and having these open conversations. Because I think we are in that generational moment now where these conversations are not so obsolete, or it's not so hidden. They're on the table.
Right.
And we can't walk away with the table and leave them there. We have to address them. So.
And that's one of the things I like about Zoom is that I can sit in a meeting block to block with someone who may have a different ideal or viewpoint than me, and we can still have this conversation, and you're kind of protected because you're in your own home, but you can still have that conversation. And I think, and there's a record of it. But
Yes.
This has been great. This has been great. Any final words? We went a little over, which is fine. We can get some mic issues, but any final comments?
I hope everything that we discussed, that we can find a way that they can modulate into action and being real. Because in being real is going to require some humility, some mercy. The one person asked them about this, they're angry, pray for mercy. God has shown us mercy. You show somebody else some mercy, and then be humble, walk humble, what you do, and love God, love your fellow man. I say that we can start doing those things, and you can just come to that point that says this has got to change. God wants us to do better, so let's start doing better.
It's good.
I think coming together is going to take some humility and some real vulnerability to listen well and to approach one another with a sense of how can we grow into this together. I think the culture around us encourages us to look at each other as competitors, to a win or lose kind of thing.
Right.
And my dad died 2.5 years ago of ALS, and as he was a physician, and in his last years he really turned into a philosopher, and he and I talked a lot on emails, but his big thing was reading Aristotle. The way it came out was very basic stuff. To live in gratitude, to have this sense of what he called thank Godfulness. So to approach each person with this sense of I thank God for you, I thank God for you, and so that that takes a humility to do that. And if we can begin those conversations there, then we have a better chance of go ahead and opening up to the really tough stuff that's going to challenge us deep down, and holding firm in our convictions and winning an argument are not the same thing. And
It's as far as the east is from the west.
Yes. So we have some calls to action for our people in Zoom land out here. So there is a vigil this coming Sunday. It marks 5 months since the murder of George Floyd. And so in Jonesborough, there is a group on Facebook, and you are more than welcome to search for the Jonesborough Vigil to End Racism. And you can make a request to join this group and see the details. But this, I know that Pastor Huff mentioned it earlier, but we say the names, have a moment of silence. There's actually a slideshow that has, it's very powerful. The faces, you can actually see the person that we are saying their name and honor them. And so if you'd like to join, please let us know, or give Karen Childress a little drop in her email box. But that's a call to action. And then, of course, please look into the Black-White Dialogue, and of course, be looking for Conversations That Matter. This episode is going to be on Facebook probably in the next week or two, and we will be sure to share that. And of course, we will get those questions that did not get asked or answered, and we'll get some answers.
Thank you.
And but yeah, thank you all for joining us and tuning in. And thank you all so much for coming
Thank
and
you.
being
Yeah,
here.
enjoyed
This
it.
was a wonderful conversation.
Fabulous.
And we hope you all stay safe, stay healthy, and mind your business and be kind.
That was
And be a nice human.
And be a good human.
Yeah, be a good human.